We're going to talk about a history of local and regional economic development in the UK. We're going to talk about why the concern, a brief history of regional policy, the current situation, and reflections and lessons over the past 50 years. And then we're going to talk about the future of local and regional economic policy. Why the concern about local and regional economic policy? Well, if we look back to 2012, and this is data on GVA or economic output per worker from the OECD, UK regions performed above former East German states or Länder in terms of GVA per worker. But if we fast forward to 2020, we have 8 regions in the UK perform worse than the worst performing East German state or Länder. So we've reached a situation where regional performance has declined and regions have diverged from the greater London region and the southeast of England. If we break that down at a local level into GVA per head by local authority area, we can see big variances in GVA per head. Up to 1980, economic growth was really for advanced economies. Development economics was for emerging economies. In the UK, there was a national focus on economic growth driven by macroeconomic policy, such as tax, monetary policy, and exchange rates. There were interventions from time to time in key industries or sectors, usually those that were declining. Regional policy did exist. It was led by national government mostly, and it was about tax incentives or planning constraints and trying to get growth to go into regions that weren't performing very well, or to try and move jobs from successful pressured regions to less successful regional economies. There was very little local development and a very limited role for local authorities. Regional development agencies did exist in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland from the mid-1970s, and these shaped some policies and approaches to economic development in the late 1990s. In the 1980s, there was a lot of change. The 1970s had witnessed big job losses in manufacturing of about 2 million workers, and this continued into the 1980s with about 1.2 million job losses. And these job losses were concentrated in northern cities and also in parts of London, which was a big manufacturing economy. The focus in policy became more about trickle down, that if the nation and the national economy grows, then others will benefit. And this affected some localities really significantly, and local authorities responded as they had to do something, facing very high unemployment levels. The national unemployment rate reached 14% in 1984, and in some localities this was reached 20 to 25%. So in the 1980s, there were the beginnings of a more localized approach to economic development. There were initiatives such as enterprise boards, local development agencies, and partnerships. And there was also the start to look at economic inclusion, looking at who benefits from growth. I grew up in the northeast of England in the 1970s and 1980s, traditionally probably the lowest performing regional economy in the UK, dominated by heavy industries such as coal mining and shipbuilding. And so, during that time, I can remember unemployment being high. Many parents of families I knew, they experienced unemployment. And it was very much a shock and a change because their whole way of life and occupation had just vanished, and they had to find a new job and a new skills and a new trade. During the 1990s, there was a recognition that the policies that had come about in the 1980s, and there was the beginning of things like regeneration policy, enterprise zones, trying to recover sites in prominent areas of cities through urban development corporations, incentivizing land reclamation, remediation, and development. And it was found there was a lot of disjointed initiatives. So a more integrated approach started in the 1990s through things like City Challenge and the single regeneration budget, which combined funding for urban regeneration into one pot. In the 2000s, things got more integrated. There was a change of government in 1997. The Labour Party came into power until 2010. They took another regional approach to the economy. They formed regional development agencies, but they also funded a lot of local activity and initiatives. And they had things like the Neighbourhood Renewal Fund, which was focused on the most deprived neighbourhoods in the country. And this spawned sub-regional economic partnerships. So local authorities became much more active in economic. There are several reasons why this regionalist approach to the economy unravelled in the 2000s. One was that regional development agencies were originally established as parts of a national government department in England, and they were meant to be then responsible to regional assemblies, which are meant to be democratically elected regional government. And this was meant to balance the national parliaments and devolution agreements made with Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So the referendum failed. Instead, they developed regional assemblies which were based on local authority leader representation, and they had responsibility for a strategic, spatial, and land use plan for each region. The spending review in 2007 cut regional development agency budgets by over £300 million. And this had a knock-on effect because a lot of regional development agency budgets were spent locally. Regional development agencies were strategic enablers and funders. They often handed the money over to local government and other local delivery partnerships. The government conducted a review of what it called the Subnational Review of Economic Development and Regeneration. There were many questions and discussions about functional economic geographies at that time. The city regions as a concept and as an institutional arrangement for economic development became more powerful in terms of the arguments. But what this served to do, it didn't come to any conclusions, this review. It just let everybody vent about how they weren't satisfied with the regional arrangements. And so it really undermined the regional agencies and regional approach. During the credit crunch and recession in 2009, there were in-year budget cuts made to RDA budgets, and these were almost £1 billion worth of cuts. In 2009, the regional planning function that was part of these regional assemblies, which were comprised of local authority leaders, there was a proposal to transfer that to RDAs, which were unelected agencies of central government. They did have boards and they had some independence, but they weren't seen as democratically legitimate enough to run regional planning policy. And again, as I said, city regions and core cities, as in the biggest UK cities, became a focus for the policy debate. It was thought that economic development and growth and jobs could be better achieved by a focus on cities and city regions, and also addressing economic problems, things like unemployment, inactivity, poverty was better addressed at a city level. And there were a lack of complementary national economic policies to regional development agencies. Regional development agencies kind of stood apart. There wasn't any integration or much integration across Whitehall. Localism came another movement, as well as city regions. Localism, that decisions are best taken locally, and economic development and regeneration functions were best done locally. But again, there was no real persuasive evidence. There was a constant fight against centralisation of initiatives. I worked in a regional development agency. Government would restrict your ability to, say, create a new business development initiative or innovation initiative. They actively constrained this. So they constrained the ability to react locally or be innovative. Again, so Whitehall controlled the funding. Essentially, regional development agencies were agencies of central government. So they lost their legitimacy by the end of the 2000s, and we're seen as not democratically accountable. We fast forward to the 2010s. The government changed in 2010. It was a Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition. They swiftly announced they were going to abolish regional development agencies. I think the difficulty was they had no idea what to replace them with, and they just simply erased regional development agencies and the experience in them. And regional development agencies, actually, they became a vehicle to combine the experience of government and economic development over a 25 and 30-year period. And so essentially the government just really cut all the institutional memory out of the system. And they cut budgets for local and regional economic development by 2/3, created these initiatives called local enterprise partnerships, invited local areas to propose local enterprise partnerships. Essentially, there was no clear objectives or role. And these were later developed, and government actually started to give a small amounts of core funding to pay for a few staff in each local enterprise partnership. Again, the role was very unfocused and developed over time, very poorly integrated into central government policies and Whitehall departments. And they created lots of different funds for growth and development. Often these were capital funds for infrastructure and property. And there were multiple funds, fragmented, time limited. And so they created this patchwork quilt of funding and initiatives which exists to this day. There was much talk about local and regional devolution and a lot of progress made in places such as Greater Manchester. But this has been partial when a combined authority now gets, £30 million a year, which is a very small budget for a local government organisation. On reflection, the 2010s were the end of an era. A lot of experience and capability was simply erased from government. There was no attempt to retain this institutional memory. Public austerity meant cuts to local authority budgets writ large. And economic development is not a statutory function of a local authority in England. So we often found these activities were wound down severely. Overall investment by the public and private sector has not recovered from 2009 in the UK. I was an interim CEO of a startup local enterprise partnership for nearly 2 years, between 2011 and 2013. And what did I learn? I learned that clear objectives and remit are important from central government if it's their initiative. These were lacking for local enterprise partnerships. And you can't really take it for granted that there's local buy-in, even though there's a promise of a more localized, locally accountable enterprise and economic partnership. People didn't really understand what it was for. You had to really work at building local involvement and buy-in. Administrative boundaries are far more practical than functional economic area boundaries. Functional economic areas, they cross local authority and government boundaries. We created in our local enterprise partnership a patchwork of local areas that didn't make a lot of administrative sense in the end. And I just think administrative boundaries are just more convenient and more practical. You can't deliver much on a shoestring budget. The expectations for local enterprise partnerships were very high. I think people were still mindful of regional development agencies. They seem to expect the same type of service and investment when literally I must have had about, a 20th of the staff and a 50th of the budget of a regional development agency. In the 2020s, there was more change. We had COVID-19 and local authorities stepped up significantly to support their local businesses during that time. LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, have now been abolished as of April 2024. European funds for regional development and for skills and training have been replaced by the Shared Prosperity Fund due to Brexit, but there's approximately 43% less money. The Levelling Up White Paper was a statement from the government with big ambitions for local economic development, but there was little investment set aside or little coherent action identified across government to make the ambitions of the Levelling Up White Paper happen. So there's a continuation of competitive grant funds, mainly for capital expenditure. So in terms of 2024, as we're moving into the general election in July, government policy for local economies has rarely been consistent for more than 5 years. Meanwhile, there's many crises and many challenges continue, such as the cost of living crisis, such as the impacts of Brexit upon trade and recruitment. So big changes, I think, are on the way after this general election. What are the lessons over the past 20, 30 years for the next UK government? Well, there's different approaches, and we can probably be more open-minded. If we want to promote the green economy and inclusive economies, we could use the UN Sustainable Development Goals approach, and that has been used in Bristol for many years successfully. There are also other approaches, such as transformative placemaking. This is something that has been really accelerated in the US. It's about nurturing economic ecosystems that are connected and rooted in local businesses and communities. And it's about having accessible, flexible, built environments that support communities as well as business and the economy. And it's about encouraging civic structures that are more local and organic. What was poor over the past 15 years, since 2010, there's been no vision for the national economy. So it's hard to develop local economic policy in the absence of national economic policy. Policies for the economy, transport, climate change, education, skills, science, innovation, planning, and place in central government don't join up. Whereas when you're working with localities and places, you need them to join up. If you're planning a development or transport improvements, you need to join up all these different factors and dynamics. The government created some partnerships and agencies, but didn't really have clear objectives for them or rationales. There's often claims that this policy would solve local economic disparities and problems, but the resources were just too small to make it happen. Obviously, local and regional economic development in some parts of the UK is a long-term challenge. We're talking 30 years, but yet we had 3-year budgets and programmes with no idea what would happen after these expired. And we have a local government system in the UK which is very well managed, accountable. They've got good assurance and financial controls. They're democratically accountable and scrutinised. But yet central government would hand grants out to local government with their own arrangements for monitoring, for auditing, which were over the top. And central government often asking local government in the UK to submit grant funding claims with the need for a lot of evidence and justification and lots of suspicion that local government can't really do economic growth and development. But then central government didn't really help with that either, didn't help local government, didn't communicate what it wanted well enough, and didn't really understand local growth and economic development either. Again, another reason not to give money for local economic development to say, well, there's no proof it works. But I would say there is proof it works. And we could say the same about a lot of other policies in national government, such as education, immigration, trade, science, law. They aren't really evaluated. So you really need to set up an evaluation culture that's transparent and clear to learn from policy and practice. What I'd like to see from the next government, let's have clear objectives from day one. Let's have a delivery bias. Let's not get caught up in these pondering esoteric debates about, well, what functional area works best? Well, why not try it out, evaluate it, and continually improve it? The first 100 days of levelling up for new government should be about delivering the significant challenges of local and regional economic disparities. Need bold responses. We need to break out of this policy regime dominated by the electoral cycle where we have 2 or 3 year funding programs that come to an end. You can't deliver long-term change in a local economy over 2 to 3 years. Again, decisions are made in Whitehall and central government without appraising how they may affect local and regional economies, whether it's HS2 or whether it's R&D and science expenditure. No account is taken of its implications for levelling up. We need better alignment of policies. If we're going to promote local and regional economic growth, we want it to be sustainable. We want it to be aligned with our education and training policies. And devolution should be a menu of policies, powers, tools, and resources that local authorities and local government can choose from. And this menu can be established in law and legislation, because instead we've had piecemeal deals that have been customised for different localities, and it's become very messy. We need to invest in and develop the community practice, having experienced, capable people working in local economic development that is going to make it more impactful and make it. We need to encourage policy experimentation. I think we need to learn from failure, and robust monitoring and evaluation systems mean that can happen.